Shall we start recording? Okay, well, just a slightly more formal welcome to everyone to this online conversation. It's part of a series organised by the Fellowship Forum, particularly initiated by Judy Rees, who's definitely a Zoom expert. She ran a great event with the chair, Vicky Haywood. As I said, I'm not such a Zoom expert, so bear with me for any glitches. And big thank you and welcome to Rima Patel for agreeing to come and share her experience and explain the Citizens Economic Council to us. So the programme has produced a prospectus for more democratic economic debate, published a DIY economic toolkit to help people understand economics and take action, run a series of workshops through its Economic Inclusion Roadshow, and it's run an extended citizens jury and set up an online crowdsourcing platform. I mean, that's an amazing program, Rima. What's it been like on the ground? Pretty frantic, I should think. But do you want to give us a little bit of history and where you've got to now?
Really enjoyed running the program. It's been such an amazing experience coming to the RSA. I joined the RSA just over a year ago, and being given this fantastic concept, which came from Matthew Taylor. Actually, he had the idea that the RSA should convene the Citizens Economic Council, so we saw very back and we thought about what the issues were around it. So the importance of literacy and ensuring that people are able to better understand economics, which often feels very jargon laden and very technocratic. The importance of a more creative, open, and more pluralist debate about economics, and that really came up within the sort of post-2008 financial crisis context, the need to widen up the discourse about economic policy. And there's also something really important about the fact that economics is about human lives when we really get down to it. And this is what came out quite profoundly throughout our workshops, when that was our Inclusion Roadshow or our Citizens Economic Council, that people went through a process where often they found that they started off with a conception of economics as something very abstract and distinct from their everyday lives. And so one of the things that you find in the toolkit is this map of the economy, which is an illustration that's designed to get people to think about how it connects to, the everyday features of their life, the job they do, the work that they do, the money that they have in their pocket, and how that connects to decisions that are often made about them, for them, and how it connects to this critical issue, I think, which we've seen post the general election in Grenfell Tower, around a disconnect between the system and people's voices, and the importance of restoring a feedback across that. So I think there's in terms of your kind of question about my experience of running the program, there's been a lot that's come through from it. But what's really, really struck me is, firstly, this point that economics is something that people connect to once they go through a process of understanding and identifying with it. And the other thing that's really struck me is how profoundly disenfranchised they currently feel by the way we talk about economics and the way we communicate about economics, and the languages and choices that we make about economics. And I wondered actually whether Sue might be able to chip in on that, but having been a participant and been through the process, whether she might have some thoughts that she might want to contribute to those points.
I think I'd just say the main thing was talking about it with other people. I was in the Manchester group, and I think we had about 24, 25 people, some of whom I've met, but a lot of whom I haven't. And to be having that conversation about what's important, what are the values behind economics, and how you make policy and how you can disagree about policy was just a learning experience for me, and improved how difficult it is when there are so many different perspectives on different problems, and all of us have different perspectives. We bring different background, we bring a different context to it. So it was the main thing I enjoyed was talking about economics with a group of other people, a group of other Mancunians, if you like, all experiencing the city in different ways. Yeah.
That's great.
And Rima, have other people stayed in touch? Have you got continuing conversation with people that you met?
So have other people? What was your question?
Have you continued to stay in touch with people who came to the workshops?
That's a good question. So we have been in touch with a number of citizens, some of whom are fellows. Sue, are you a fellow? Well, Sue might, yes, she is a fellow. So we offer fellowship to a number of our citizens, in fact all of them, and a number of them took fellowship up. So that's been a really kind of pleasing, obvious impact that, you know, we've got a wide range of voices who've been involved in the process who are now fellows. We've also been commissioning and doing a documentary, and we followed a range of citizens through the Citizens Economic Council through a documentary, and so I've also arranged a few delegation meetings with Matthew Taylor, for example, and a local authority chief executive in Barking and Dagenham, which citizens were able to attend if they wanted to, and so we've been doing a lot of that in terms of follow up, and of course the Citizens Economic Council report, when it's written up, still in the analysis phase, will be followed up with the citizens. So I've asked a number of our citizens to be on our review panel for that, and also a few citizens have volunteer to be on the evaluation panel for the crowdsourcing challenge as well. So we've got a mixed panel of economists and program team and citizens for our crowdsourcing challenges. So there's plenty of follow-up happening as a consequence of that. The set of values which she mentioned is actually really important. It's a citizens' economic charter that was co-created across the deliberation session, and it was quite noticeable that sustainability was considered to be amongst one of the most important values in that charter, and there was a sort of three-part definition of sustainability, which was really interesting. So the co-created economic charter defines sustainability as something that isn't just about environmental sustainability and protecting the planet for future generations, but also is about economic resilience. Speaking to that point about post 2008 financial crisis, and is also about social sustainability. So the sustainability that comes from a stronger social and community bond, and that's very much something that we're publishing as part of a report as well. That charter. One of the things that we ask citizens to do as part of this deliberative process is to come up with some policy ideas that would be emblematic of the values outlined in the charter. And as Sue mentioned, there was a particular kind of practicality associated with that, which is the sort of balancing of trade-offs and the fact that it's quite difficult to find policy that is, I guess, working always in the interest of absolutely everyone. So there was something there about the impact that the process of going through policy making had on participants.
So Does anybody want to come in with some questions at that point? Or any observations from your own experience of thinking about economics and sustainability? Yes, Sheila, I'll unmute your mic.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that if there is another meeting in Manchester, I would be very interested in trying to get across to it, because we don't have many members in the Isle of Man, and I have a wide background in Manchester, so I would very much like to join you another time. I haven't been able to go to anything for a long time because my husband has been very ill, but he died a couple of months ago, and he wanted me to carry on with my work that I had put on hold until he was better. So I would be very interested. It sounds as though you've done so much work and got so many people together. If I can add anything to it, I would be very pleased to help.
Great. So, yeah, what maybe there's a little bit of what's next there. Yes.
Yeah. So, what's next for the Citizens Economic Council? Or
well, I think
David,
I wasn't. I had a little bit of distortion there, but was Sheila saying that it would be good to find a way to connect in future there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think there's several things that we're exploring at this moment. We're certainly thinking about connecting with networks such as Rethinking Economics. I'm on the advisory group of Rethinking Economics, based in Manchester, and a variety of other related networks. And at this moment, it's quite early stage, but we're certainly exploring a Manchester launch of the Citizens Economic Council reports. So that's very much scheduled, and so happy to follow up and provide more information about that. There's also, I guess, like what's next for the Citizens Economic Council is just thinking about how processes like the Citizens Economic Council can be I guess, implemented and tested by organisations that have decision-making authority and power. One of the institutions and experts that came along was the housing advisor Andy Burnham at the Manchester workshop. Councillor Beth Mills, she came along to that particular meeting. We also invited a representative from Bank of England, and so I think there is something about the role that the RSA can play in terms of convening and brokering conversations between citizens and institutions, but it does place the onus on institutions like the Bank of England, local authorities, to start thinking very seriously about how these processes are embedded in the way that they do policy making. So that's something that's really kind of interesting and relevant for us for next steps. I've noticed a couple of questions here on the Zoom group chat. One was, what was the range of citizens we spoke to and what were their background? Really important question. So these approaches tend to use a methodology called quota sampling, where you specify a group of 50 to 60, and then you recruit based on a quota a mixed and diverse range of citizens. With this particular initiative, given the level of commitment that was required, we also used snowball sampling, which was when you go through, you target particular groups from a diversity of background, ethnic minority, women, disabled, etc., and then you ask them if they know other similar people in their networks, so that you can ensure that you get a breadth of voices in the room. But what's really important about this is that it can't be representative, so it's not 50 to 60 representative voices, but it is diverse. It is much more diverse than the plurality of voices that you might get around your more conventional decision-making table on a particular policy issue. And the other really important point is that people were given vouchers to acknowledge the time involved, and I think that's very important when you're thinking about some of the barriers for participation, particularly for people who are on lower income. In terms of the other question, which is on this chat, there was a question about whether there's scope to invite fellows to suggest policy based on the finding. The conversations that we've had, firstly, I think that's a great idea, actually, based on the Citizens' Economic Charter. We could certainly run a crowdsourcing exercise around that. So I'll definitely take that away and have a think about it. Thanks for that suggestion. But in the meantime, there are other crowdsourcing opportunities out there. And it's really important for me to stress that they came from the deliberations that were happening at the time with the citizens around some of these issues. So we came out of the London and Manchester deliberations, and they really helped us frame the questions that we then put out for crowdsourcing, because there were particular issues that were picked up on, and one of them was around this kind of issue about how people can get a fairer deal on the goods and services they buy, and that language was literally picked up out of one of the deliberations that we ran on market. So and then sustainability again is something that people felt very strongly about during the Citizens' Economic Council, and we felt that was a good basis for their challenge. Just wondered whether anyone had any other questions.
Getting quite a bit of noise off a microphone there, banging. I don't know. Is it okay for most people? Fine.
Oh, is that?
Yeah, I've got a question. I'm wondering if the question of the expense of living alone, particularly old people, if you get a small quantity of things, you get charged disproportionately more than if you get bulk buys. Was that a concern of people?
So the cost of living on your own. I mean, I don't think we went that granular, but one of the things that did definitely come up was generally the cost of living, and certainly when I have looked at the notes and feedback and so on, one of the other issues that definitely came up was the issue of some people being unfairly penalised based on either their financial circumstances or their social or economic characteristics in terms of purchasing certain goods and services. So that came up quite profoundly. We had a really interesting discussion in one of the tables about the fact that a lot of people who are poorer often are unfairly penalised, for example, because they are less able to access certain deals that might be online or that might be available through a bank, and they don't have a bank account, for instance, and they might be less able to sign up for a direct debit because of their financial circumstances. So and that unfairly penalised them as well. And that actually turned into the basis for our first crowdsourcing challenge around how citizens can get a fairer deal on what they buy, which sounds quite top-level, but there's different ways you can interpret that. One is the consumer rights angle, absolutely, but the other is that some people, because of their circumstances, their position, are unfairly penalised. And I think this kind of point about people living on their own, being unfairly penalised as well, is quite striking. And other groups, so if you're disabled, then the cost of a hotel room that is accessible is significantly higher in a central London or central Manchester location than the cost of a hotel room for somebody who isn't disabled. So there's quite that discussion did come out quite strongly.
Thanks.
And there was a Nikki raised a question here of any findings about the use of the toolkit, and I popped a link to the toolkit in there.
Great. So we found that the toolkit's being used in really interesting and slightly unexpected ways. So, I mean, it's on a Teach First ambassador network, and so have received quite a bit of feedback from teachers about how they've been using elements of the toolkit for citizenship curricular purposes. That's been really interesting to see. The organisation, I think that you're quite well connected with Doing Social, have been profiling the toolkit as part of Leeds Beckett University co-creation degree collaboration. So my colleague Jackie Howard went along to the launch of that and showcased the toolkit, and the toolkit has been used in that context since, and we're having a discussion about the extent to which that could be embedded within the education curriculum, which is really exciting for the co-creation toolkit. So there's something about the way in which the toolkit's reached more formalised education networks than we actually thought it would have. And the other thing is that we have been working with both economy and Rethinking Economics to reach networks of young students and other economic professionals who are interested in widening the application of these principles beyond just economists to a wider discussion. So I'm conscious that a lot of economics students have been using the toolkit as well as part of their works around creating more pluralist thinking and networks on higher educational discussions on economics. And then finally, last and absolutely not least, we have been doing a lot of work with the fellowship with the toolkit. So went just a week ago to a social enterprise conference hosted in Plymouth, and the local press was very kind enough to write us up chapter and verse and profile the toolkit in the local newspaper and connect to it. But in the meantime, I think we're still in communications phase at the moment with the toolkit, with the fellowship. We do intend in the next 6 months to 8 months, so nearing the end of the programme, to contact everybody who's downloaded the toolkit. We have that behind data capture and run a survey and get a much more comprehensive understanding of how it's been used. But today, I think it's been a pretty successful initiative so far. I actually wondered, I remember you came along to the launch of the toolkit, and I just wondered whether you'd had a chance to sort of see how it's been used and whether you'd used it and that sort of thing. Be interested to have your reflections on that question.
I haven't actually used it myself yet, but I've still got some ideas that about how I might like to try it. I've been in touch with Harsha from Doing Social, so I knew already that she was sort of looking at how she might use it, and I contributed to her some of her thinking around that. So that's been sort of my foray into it so far. And I mean, obviously on the launch day, we only had a brief look through, whereas I've obviously looked a lot more at the different exercises and the tools in there and had a think about them. I have to say I haven't taken it forward so far, but still there in the background as something that I might like to look at a bit more and maybe think a bit more deeply about how it could be used with different types of groups in non-educational settings, because I think that was my abiding impression at the time when it was launched, was that there was some formal settings where it could be really useful, but how do you draw in people who are not already in a formal educational place and looking for that kind of engagement. So
that's really, I mean, I think that's really valuable feedback. So we're using the networks that we have, so the relationship with Rethinking and Economy, the fellowship network, and then I guess the RSA's got very strong connections with a lot of educational establishments. But if anyone here has got any suggestions about other networks we could reach out to, I'll happily take those suggestions and follow up on them. And as well, I mean, if you've got any suggestions on how we can make it easier for you guys to use and deploy some of the tools in the toolkit, I'll be really keen to have that discussion. It could be something we can take offline, but yeah.
Great. Shall we
Hello.
just take a couple of other, we can come back onto connecting with networks and other ways of taking things forward. Maybe we could take one of the other questions here. Robin asked about scale. Robin, do you want to say something about that? Robin said...
I was interested in, I'm new to it, so I've just actually followed the link, so I'm getting a better understanding of the toolkit, how it fits in. And I was just interested in whether the scale of the economy was something that featured in the work. So, the difference between a town or the city, a citywide, Manchester-wide, or regional, or even the nation. I mean, the economics are different at different scales, and I wondered if that featured at all. Scale featured as one of the aspects of the.
So, I think it did. I think that there was, I mean, one of the challenges for the Citizens Economic Council has always been that attempting to explore the economy as a system over a deliberative process, even if it did last for 5 days over a 5-month period, it was always going to be a bit of a monumental task. And many citizens felt that they connected their everyday lives very intuitively to some of the discussions that we're having. So whilst we spoke about issues like markets and how they work and money and how that's created, and we had a discussion about economic institutions and citizens, when we did have these discussions, they did very much come back to people's ordinary everyday experiences and then their experiences in their localities and so on. I actually want to ask Sue to say a bit about her experience of this, how that conversation played out, because I feel that would be a bit more insightful than my experience, because I would speak with a facilitator hat on, and Sue would be speaking as somebody who'd actually had that experience of going through those steps and those stages.
Yeah, well, for me it was mainly the big picture stuff, so sort of UK wide, understanding. Certainly the picture that Rima talked about was all embracing. It was all the different players within the economy. So it was that broad, really, for me. The policies that we were coming up with were for the whole country as opposed for different regions. But again, you have different people with different aspects. I appreciate the bigger picture, but my focus in terms of this thing called economics would be making sure that once the policies are set, that the funding is spent in the way it's supposed to be spent. So sort of scrutinising Manchester City Council in the way that it's implementing policies. And also now we've got the Greater Manchester Mayor scrutinising the Greater Manchester implementation of economic policies. So I'm glad it was a bigger picture. As Rima has said, we didn't focus down on nitty-gritty stuff. It was intended to be, I think, at the macro level primarily.
Yeah.
Can I
exactly.
Oh, go on. Carry on, Rima.
Exactly. I mean, we did want to talk about the economy as a system, because there have been deliberative processes that have have explored, local issues. There have been deliberative processes that focus on how that relates to, how say a particular decision in a locality, so planning, for example, impacts on people and how that can be looked at differently. And those are all really interesting initiatives, and I'm certainly really interested in the way deliberation can help unpick that. But what I thought was really interesting about the process that we ran was how it deliberately kept the agenda quite wide, and so allowed this sort of exploration of how money works and is created, and there's kind of pluralist narratives about markets and institutions and the relationship between people and institutions, and allow people to bring their own lens and to the issue, and therefore to identify what matters most to them, because often when you start with a really kind of narrow agenda and you sort of say that this is the question that I want to put to you, and this is the framing within which we're exploring this particular issue, you actually lose a lot of really good stuff about where people want to go with it. And so we found that we were being very adaptive in a way, that we started off with a plan and we broadly followed that plan, but we did really have to think through the implications of what the second day and the third day and the fourth day looked like off the back of what we were hearing on, day 1, day 2, day 3. And I think that's good. I think that's what engagement should be like. So I certainly felt that I got a lot out of that process. I just wanted to very quickly share this picture that we're all talking about, because I'm conscious that not everyone's had a chance to see it. So I'm going to press the share screen button. It's never happened before, so bear with me if it all goes horribly wrong. Oh, interesting. Okay, great. So this is it, really. And there is a box in the right-hand corner which very much says that there's a lot missing. What's missing is a kind of open question there. But really, this is something that came as an idea quite early in the programme. It's sort of grappling with why anyone should really care about the economy. What material, what resources might we be able to create that really gets home very, very quickly why anyone should care? Is really the thinking that underpinned the creation of this map. So I'm going to stop share and go back and return to discussion.
And could we maybe just take a couple of other points and then come on to the 2 questions which, Rima, you posed for discussion? Sheila said something about her background, which may be in social enterprise and designing a wholesale community development fund. So maybe the community perspective, the social enterprise perspective is interesting in there. And then Peter asked about connecting with students and recent school leavers. Does that trigger any thoughts for you?
Okay, yeah. So on the community development point, I think that's really a really interesting area in which a lot of really good work in participation has happened. And I guess, like, as a sector, the charitable sector could be much better at cross-fertilizing and sharing lessons and learning. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is the development of initiatives like participatory budgeting at a community level by organisations like Big Local and the Local Trust and so on. So I've been following that quite closely. I'm really interested in the sort of idea that participation plus the transfer of power has the ability to have a really tangible effect on people's locality, and also on their own personal well-being and so on. And I mean, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on any evaluations or anything that you yourself have experienced at community level that could be valuable for something like this in the Economic Council, which is about building the case for these sorts of deliberative processes. And I think that very often when they happen at a local level, they are really able to have quite significant and profound effects on people in really interesting ways, because there's that connection between what people would like to see and the reality of that actually happening, which is so interesting. I remember in a workshop that I ran in Glasgow, I came across with a housing association called Arden Glen. This group of participants had been really involved in the delivery of a community development initiative and had the chance to shape what that looked like. And it was a group of largely over 50 women who ran Pilates and gardening and regular exercise, and they started off with this initiative, and then it became much more about the creation of a network, and then so they started to apply for funding, to work with local schools to run a test and participatory budgeting. It was a really, really fascinating conversation that I had with them. But effectively what happened is, after a while, the funding, which was NHS funding for the walking and the gardening and the activity, ran out, and they just continued their engagement in this network, and they continued the network, and they continued to really kind of, I guess, scale that up. And I thought that was a really powerful moment in the sort of roadshow process, where that really showcases the often unintended but really powerful impacts that community development has, and I just wish that at a national and at a central level we were much better at recognising that there are these unintended and powerful impacts that are still valuable, even if they're not necessarily what was originally envisaged or planned or minutely written down as the KPI somewhere. And I think that story does illustrate quite a lot of what's wrong with the way that policymaking is done, and showcases why these sorts of processes are so important.
Right, I was just going to say that maybe we could just have. I mean, Sheila might want to come back on that. I also know that Drew has done quite a lot of work at community level in this, and actually posted something on the forum. Just briefly, because we want to get on to some other questions. Sheila, did you want to come back on what Rima was saying? Does that chime in with your experience?
People together, things take off, that they start talking, particularly when it's women. I have to say men are a bit more shy, and then they just start doing something quite small, and then it just takes over. Their lives change, and they change other people's lives as well. And just one thing I would say about economics, the Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, well, his book is subtitled Economics as if People Mattered. And I think that's very much what you're doing now, is economics as if people mattered. And I would be, as anything I can do to help you, I will do. You have lots of things that you might not have thought of, the funding side of things, that if I can help with signposting or whatever, for that I can do. And things like local pounds, local money that recycles, and it's worth so much more if it's recycled locally. There are all sorts of issues, apart from the bigger one of the main point of your economics thing. I just realised I'm sitting in front of my husband's, all his books, he's a doctor, was a doctor, are all on biology and medicine. That isn't my background.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Great. Drew, did you, just because we seem to have a scope for a few collaborations here or carry through, I didn't want to lose the point. Drew, did you want to say anything briefly about the work that you've done and you mentioned in a posting to the forum? Can't hear you, Drew. Can't hear you. No? Have you got a mic switched off? Maybe can we? Yeah, we'll switch. Try again. No. Anybody hear Drew? No, can't hear you, Drew.
Can I suggest Drew shares his comments in the chat window?
Yeah, can you do it in the chat window, Drew? But can we just move to the point that Peter raised about the lots of untapped enthusiasm from students and recent school leavers? Did you catch some of that, Rima?
Yeah. So, I mean, that is really a lot of the work that Rethinking Economics have done. Are you able to see me? Because it says my internet connection is unstable, so I'm a bit distracted by that. Are you? Yeah, you're fine. Okay, great. So absolutely yes. We have a very good relationship with Rethinking Economics, which is a student-led international network campaigning for more pluralist economics curricula. So I think that's absolutely right. There is a lot of untapped enthusiasm from students from recent school leavers. I think there is a particular momentum behind the idea that economics needs to open up a dialogue and conversation, and there's a particular momentum behind the idea that traditional economics curricula are quite limited in terms of the way they teach economics, and fail to recognise that economics is about a plurality of values and perspectives, and that people are not always the rational agents that conventional economic theory and model suggest they are. And so I think there is a lot of energy around that. We are working with schools. We have run workshops with schools and with students as young as 12 and 13 on economics, and used methods like Lego serious play in order to kind of work with young people to build models of the economy and talk about some of the issues that play out and to explore that. And that's very much a part of opening economics up. But I do think that it is also about recognising this is a conversation that everyone can participate in, and that it's not just about a particular demographic. And one of the strengths of the Citizens Economic Council workshops and the Economic Inclusion Roadshow workshop is that they have allows for really interesting intergenerational conversations to happen. So I ran a workshop in Talbot as part of the Economic Inclusion Roadshow, and there was such an interesting conversation that happened between a group of people who had lived in the area for 30 or 40 years and had seen the area change quite drastically as a consequence of deindustrialisation, and then young people who expressed their very real frustration with not having the opportunities that they felt that they should have, and a really kind of interesting conversation of, well, it wasn't always that way, and the area has experienced profound shifts and changes, and by the way, the entire makeup and fabric of our society and our community has changed, and that's had a real impact on young people people such as ourselves, so we feel like we've been pushed to move down Port Talbot and so on. So I think there's something about yes, age demographics are really interesting, and there's something really interesting about the intergenerational conversation these sorts of processes facilitate, and so that came through really, really strongly. Sue, did you have any thoughts or any reflections on that? Did you come across any particular intergenerational conversation through the Citizens Economic Council?
Not particularly. We had a good mix on the Manchester sessions, and it was just healthy to have the view of the youth, but then you wouldn't want the country to be totally run by the youth, because they just don't have experience. They haven't had the lived experience, for example, of those people in Port Talbot, of how things can change and everything. So yeah, I just think the mix of generations was very healthy. Yeah.
I think it's one of those issues where you do get really quite different perspectives if you manage to ensure that you have a wide range of ages and backgrounds in the room, and it's quite hard to sort of pin that down, but the conversation just takes a different direction of travel.
Okay, are you happy to move now to some questions that Rima raised earlier? I mean, one on how can democratic innovations lead to more sustainable policy, I think was the first one. But Rima, do you want to kind of restate the question which you thought we might like to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the really thinking behind this question was, so I'll sort of state the question, which is, can democratic innovations like the Citizens Economic Council lead to more sustainable policies? So policy that leads to more sustainable outcomes might be a better way of putting it. And the thinking behind this is that we do tend to have decision-making processes that are often quite reactive in many ways, in short-term timeframes. And I guess a question that I have for you was whether you think there's the potential that there might be other interests that are considered through the use of these processes, and if so, how and why, and so on. And feel free to think more broadly than just the Citizens Economic Council and that particular democratic innovation. I guess the idea is new forms of emerging innovations in democracy, so engagement, civic technology, and some of the work that you're doing on community development and participation might be particularly relevant here.
Anyone like to respond to that one? Drew, can you?
Yeah. I would just.
Robin?
I mean, we've been working on the sustainability network. We've been working quite a lot around circularity. So how can we help the basic economic model of business move to becoming more circular, less sales, more that's really a big focus at the moment of a lot of the work or the subgroups that we have in the sustainability network.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really interesting. Did you say business? Was it business that was?
Well, I mean, it's the whole economic process. In essence, we're looking for, the current economic model is one of taking materials, doing things to it, and using it, buying it, and throwing it away. And we're trying to move to, from a material perspective, a more circular approach. So we can still do those things, but the idea is we don't pollute at the end of it, and we sustain our resource pool by reusing it, recycling it, and reprocessing it. And to do that requires in some respects, the economic model of business to change, so it's more rental orientated, more lease orientated, less selling, and more sort of longer relationships with your customers.
Yeah. And one of the areas that we're doing quite a lot of thinking on here is this sort of wider question about stakeholder value, and how businesses in particular can speak to the issue of not just focusing on shareholder returns, but also think about how they design processes that ensure that they are responding to and engaging with the stakeholders in their localities and their communities, customers, suppliers, but workers, so on and so forth. And what I think is quite interesting is the sort of potential that deliberation has in those contexts, because often these processes are seen as processes commissioned by policymakers and decision makers, but there's an argument that if you are looking to engage effectively and well with your stakeholders, you should do that early on rather than later, and you should do that in an informed and considered way, particularly if you're a large corporate with potentially huge impacts on your environment and so on. And so what I think is really interesting about that is that these processes could potentially be part of that circular economy conversation that businesses could convene with their suppliers and their stakeholders about how they can create, I guess, how they can create products or services that minimise or the impacts on the environment and or are sustainable. So I think there's something about thinking quite widely about how models like the Citizens Economic Council can be used. But that would be one way of many, I suppose.
Nikki,
on that basis, thinking about how you engage businesses, I suppose thinking about the model that you've developed may also be a way for them to get other feedback from their potential consumers. So I guess it sounds to me like if you can demonstrate the value of that model in flushing out all kinds of points of view, it's about a kind of win-win for them in terms of going beyond the should of designing more sustainable products to actually designing products that are appealing to their consumers, which is what they want at the end of the day, and can then satisfy their shareholders as well as their community stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always these things can sometimes be a bit of a tension, because I think there's definitely an argument for deliberative processes as resulting in a win-win, and often, that kind of classic example of negotiations where negotiations fail because there's a lack of communication, there's all sorts of barriers, there's all sorts of assumptions that are patently false about those who are in a negotiation. It's very much the sort of thing that plays out all the time without us realizing it, and unless we create processes that address those and mitigate those barriers, then you do often get less than the most optimal outcome for all stakeholders involved. And I think that's a prime example of ways in which that might happen. However, one of the challenges around building the legitimacy of such processes is that they often require sharing power, and some level of power, and much of the resistance to the use of such processes comes from resistance to the sharing of power. So I think it's got to be two-way, I suppose, is the point. That's kind of our learning from there. And so I guess institutions, businesses and so on have to realise that there's an advantage to giving power up as well. It's about building their legitimacy, but also about creating better, making better decisions that benefit everybody. Yeah.
Rima, is that a good point to trip into the other question you raised, which were about how to achieve change? I think you said, what are the wider system shifts and leadership changes required for us to have changes that meet the needs of tomorrow's world? And you said that led into a crowdsourcing challenge. So maybe if we had kind of 10 minutes, 15 minutes on that, conscious that we'll end at 9 o'clock, and we should just maybe leave ourselves 10 minutes before the finish. Would that be okay, Rima? Have a go at that one?
Yeah, of course. So, hello? Hi?
Yes, do you want to just, I read it out, but you just want to paraphrase it, restate it, or
yeah,
see what sort of thoughts you had already?
Yeah. So I guess this really picks up quite nicely on the sort of the question that Nikki asked, and this kind of discussion that we had about we just had this conversation about what's required for deliberative processes like this to be successful, and some of that's about power sharing, and some of that's about recognizing the potential for win-win solutions because of all the barriers that often get in the way of arriving at a resolution. But one of the things that has been really interesting through the Citizens Economic Council deliberations has been this issue of the role that institutions often have in setting the agenda and setting an example, in being leaders, in and the power that they have to change incentives that that mean that people behave differently, and in terms of their impact on the environment, but more broadly in terms of I guess an economy and an environment that works for us all in the longer term. And so that's what really underpins this crowdsourcing challenge. What role can those with a lot of power take to take a leadership role on sustainability, and B, make sure that they're setting the tone, the agenda, and reshaping incentives that help everybody else to also take responsibility and mitigate their impact on the environment.
So anybody like to come back on that really big question?
Sorry.
So is that partly, Rima, what can organisations that wish to enable people to make change do to assist that? And maybe the converse of that, if organisations aren't prepared to do that, what are the best levers for change?
I think that's a good way of framing it. I mean, I suppose we could take a few examples. I mean, Tim Jackson, who's an ecological economist, has written extensively about this idea of prosperity without growth, and in this book that he's written, he talks about the need for fundamental culture shift. So, I mean, you may agree with that, you may disagree with that, that's the spirit of economic pluralism, but just a fundamental culture shift in the way that we view ourselves as human beings and as citizens, and shift. And there's a wonderful section in there about consumerism and the impact that's had on our sense of self as citizens, and in particular the tension between government policy, which often I guess, encourages and benefits from people spending and consuming more, and policy that might be better in the long term for the environment. So there's something about the dilemma he calls of prosperity. So on one hand, governments need to raise tax revenues, and they need to get meet their budgets, and they need to support the economy to grow and ensure that there are jobs and so on, because there are short-term political imperatives. But on the other hand, doing that at a breaking point will lead to a system that fundamentally fails. That means that people struggle to preserve the environment, and so you've got this dilemma, this tension. And my question really is how we can address that tension. How can institutions like the government, Bank of England, local authorities take a leadership role and tackle that dilemma?
When Wendy threw in a something here about her work on leadership and governance. Wendy, do you want to say something about that? Wendy?
Hello, hi. I'm suffering from a very sore throat, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So probably a bit husky. Yes, we're working on sustainability in terms of the leadership models and how hierarchical organisations are leaving so many ideas on the table that are value creating. So how can you create social networks as agile communities that coalesce around purpose? And how can we get smarter at driving idea flow through the organisation with a connected hierarchy? So it's looking at some sort of elaborate models and really putting up the challenge that, to continue doing what we're currently doing is missing out on so much innovation and is driving very high levels of disengagement in most organisations. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what the work's about. So there might be some read across about how we get better at crowdsourcing ideas through social networks, and how we then check those for fit with an organisation's purpose, and start to do the sorts of things that most of us who've worked in organisations do, because we find our way around the system and turn what is effectively an amateur sport into a sort of professional way of working, and review how organisations work. I don't know if that gives you a sort of flavour, but happy to follow up.
It sounds to me like a great opportunity for another session. Drew, is your microphone working yet? Because I know you've dropped in something about network leadership. No, can't hear you. Sorry, but maybe we can follow up later on that one. But genuinely, I think that would chime very much with Judy Rees's work. And Rima, do you want to come back on that one? Is that again a topic that you think has got a lot of legs?
So which one, the network leadership one, or the
well, really, I mean, a lot of reframing, I think, that Wendy was talking about.
Okay, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these concepts are really emergent at this moment in time, but there's something about the leadership and governances, and not that different from this idea of a networked society. Actually, I think these points are really connected, which is that we have experienced really profound transitions and changes in the way that we communicate, in the way that power is dispersed, in the way that we are in our expectations of, I guess, more conventional models, and most models and institutions and organisations haven't quite caught up with that yet, and are in a phase or in a stage at which they are doing so, and it's a really exciting and a really volatile time, quite dynamic. But there is a sort of question which is about this sort of short-term and long-term, that in a way, because power is more dispersed, understanding what drives the use of that power is quite difficult. So if you take a really, I guess, very superficial example, which is this kind of Twitter echo chamber, that now drives decision making that is often very iterative, dynamic, 24/7. And you see, you know, campaigns win off the back of social media furor that happens in quite a discrete environment, in a controlled environment. And but then there's a question about whether that is actually in the long-term best interest of society. So, and it's a question to ask, because one classic example was post sort of general election. The general election debate actually about the social care proposal by the Conservative Party, and the backlash that came up against those social care proposals, irrespective of whether you agreed or disagreed with that. What I thought was quite interesting was that we never moved to a conversation about the funding of social care and how we ensure that the interests of people who need social care are protected. We never were able to move away from this very reactive way of engaging with policy to something that was more considered, more thoughtful, more, okay, let's sit down and work out I guess a deal that works for people, that people can come to a consensus around. And that's really what we need with big challenges, whether it's social care or climate change or other sorts of issues. And I just wonder whether we're the incentives that we're creating now pull in opposite directions from where we really should be going. It's certainly a question worth asking. And there's another question, which is, you know, can we create systems, and not just institutions, but systems that mitigate that, so that we and does deliberation and dialogue and these sorts of approaches have a role to play in doing that?
Just a week or two ago, the technology correspondent of The Observer, Charles Arthur, had what I thought was rather a good piece, in which he likened the climate of social media to the threats of climate change. And he said that back at the outset of the Industrial Revolution, people didn't recognize the impact that pollution from industrial processes would actually cause. And perhaps what we're creating in the democratic process is a pollution from social media, which we haven't managed to cope with yet. I thought it was a powerful analogy.
Yeah, I think that is really powerful.
So,
there's a lot of noise, and it's what's really interesting is the sort of impact that's having on people's ability to so I think there's some research that's happening in Stanford about the impact it's having on people's cognitive abilities, particularly young people's cognitive abilities, that have constantly absorbing and assimilating information in this way is affecting their ability to discern truth from falsehood. There's a whole rise of the sort of fake news agenda, but also impact on people's ability to feel like they're alert at appropriate time. And then there's, yeah, exactly, the exhaust of social media, I think. And I mean, it's kind of, there's something really interesting about whether that's a symptom more generally of this kind of society that we've created, that actually it is possible to have this exhaustive social media, be constantly on Twitter and Facebook, and constantly be expected to respond immediately to messages and so on. Does that say something about what we value and what we've chosen to prioritize? I'm just pushing the questions back at you guys because it's a discussion, but well, maybe it does.
I think there's probably another half an hour in that one, but I'm conscious that we've got 10 minutes to go. And Charlotte very helpfully drew up a little timetable at the beginning to remind me that by this time we perhaps should be doing a little bit of reflection and then moving towards a wrap-up. And already we've got, if you have a look at chat, a couple of points from Robin about the work of the Sustainability Network. And I think we've got some really nice connections beginning there. Nikki flagged up a connection with the Reinventing Work network. So, you know, talk of self-organizing processes there, less hierarchical organizations, use of different methods to support that. So, I mean, I would encourage you maybe just to take a moment to think of, are there some real nuggets, points of intersection of value that have come out of this conversation that we might follow up further? We can certainly follow them up on the forum. If you're not a member of the forum and you are a fellow, hope that you will join. And secondly, we do, I think, have the scope for more of these Zoom events. And I was encouraging Wendy towards one of those, and I think she was responding to that. If anyone else would like to think of a way of following up, that would be great. So where next? Anything that anyone would really like to pursue? Yes, Sheila.
Chats be saved so that it will enable us to follow up with individuals, because there isn't time to note down.
We can save the chat, Sheila, and we can post it in the discussion on the forum so that everyone's able to connect afterwards.
Thank you very much. That would be great.
I wonder what scope there is also to pursue some of these ideas through linking them to fellows' own projects that they're pursuing. So particularly things around sustainability of design of projects, etc. I wonder how much that's considered within some of the projects that different fellows are doing, and how we can feed that into some of the kind of, well, all the different kinds of projects that may not fall under the sustainability banner. And also maybe a question around how this all fits with the Sustainable Development Goals, and how we can feed into those as well and connect these ideas up.
Okay, and if you could, you know, drop these points into chat and then maybe into the forum, we will certainly follow them up. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of follow up on my point about the Sustainability Network and what's been going on there. It's quite pertinent to all of these things, really. We've been getting together a whole raft of groups, fellows-led groups, that have been working across the whole economy, really, at a level below government, to look at trying to achieve certain outcomes. So we've had groups working on changing behaviour, consumer behaviour, how people are working in more sustainable ways. We've had a whole raft of groups working around production and trying to get this circularity working on the manufacturing side of uses. We've got groups that are starting to look at commerce and things like fiduciary duty, how to influence boards to become and act more sustainably. We have an SDG group, which I run, which looks about the connection between the Sustainability Network and the SDG goals, and very much seen as a conduit between the network subgroups and applying or trying to interact with the SDGs. So there is actually quite an interesting spread of activity at that sort of level below government, even actually having something that looks at responding to government consultations.
Great.
So it's quite an interesting group that maybe has an interaction with the economic, at government level. I mean, we're trying to sort of balance the two, really.
That's great. Can I just bring Sue in maybe for a final word on this? Sue, you were raising your hand earlier, I think.
I was, yeah. I suppose for me it's simple. If I wanted to change Rima's behaviour, I wouldn't set up a network to discuss Rima's behaviour and deliberate about it and discuss it. I would get to know Rima, understand what's driving her, and then become her buddy and show her a better way if I think that her way is not the right way for social justice. And that's what I find in local government. I see discrepancies whereby there is funding for certain programs but they're not implemented on the ground. So I go onto the Manchester City Council's website, look up their policy, and then I point out to the relevant person that they're not following their policy. So I've put a note in the chat about, could RSA lead on setting up a citizen shadow cabinet? So it's what the official opposition does when Theresa May established her cabinet and put certain senior leaders, they've got the power in certain positions. The first thing the official opposition does is map itself to that structure, and they have a one-on-one scrutiny of, okay, whoever is leading on sustainability, let's have someone senior at the RSA scrutinising that individual and crowdsourcing ideas and stuff. I just don't know whether I explain well enough. It's when you think, oh, that's wrong, and set up a network to discuss it. I worked 30 years in business change, so if you wanted to change something in business, you went to whoever had the power, the sponsor, to make change and said, is this a good idea? Let's do it. So it's that's what I was trying to say. And having seen the success of how Rima was able to bring a Citizens Economic Council together to scrutinise economic policy, why not a Citizens Cabinet to scrutinise the work of the Cabinet?
Well, one of the things that we... hi, can you hear? Can you hear?
Yeah, that's okay. Maybe just... wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I was just thinking that sounds like the next great programme for Matthew Taylor to get enthused about. And I hope, Sue, that you'll drop that as a post into the forum or turn it into something which some brave soul could pitch to Matthew.
Okay. Well, one of the things that's quite interesting is this kind of question about Brexit. And this discussion about a cross-party Brexit committee. And so we have already called for a Citizens Economic Brexit Council, which, I mean, these are the sorts of, there's different ways in which you can run these deliberative processes, and I'm quite keen to experiment with different approaches. So one approach is this sort of, I guess, slightly campaigning, armchair auditing type model, but then there's also a sort of model which is about sharing, which is about being equals and partners at the same table and with the sharing of power, and that's really difficult to get to, but you can get to that stage. There are initiatives and innovations across the world that have done that. So in some ways, that's arguably even more radical, because it's not just sort of going to the decision maker and saying, can this happen? In the instance of things like participatory budgeting, it's, can you transfer the power that gives a group of citizens the ability to put forward proposals and turn that into a reality and go through a process, and for that to have as much legitimacy as influencing someone to make something happen. And and we haven't got there yet, but it is an international movement, and you know, it's happening in places like Toronto and Boston and Seville and Paris, and you know, it is happening all over the world. It's been happening in Brazil since 1987. So I suppose the point being, another world is possible.
I'm quite loath to end the discussion, because it's really running very, very well. I mean, Charlotte, just in terms of the mechanics of rounding this up, I hope I've got a recording of this, which we can post back into the forum. I'm not sure if everybody is a fellow and could access the forum, but I'm sure we're open to any ideas that anyone has for following through on this. Any thoughts on that?
What I would say we can do immediately is we'll post that chat, and as you mentioned, the recording in the forum. I should be able to see who's a fellow and who isn't, so if there are people who aren't fellows and can't access that, we'll be in touch separately. Rima, did you want to say anything about Wazoku and crowdsourcing quickly? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry.
Hi. So we do have a crowdsourcing challenge on this last question about longer term incentives and how we can how actually institutions and other leaders can reshape them in order to think in a more sustainable way about longer term past short term incentives. But I think the best thing to do is to share that link, which I will do now.
I can do it.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah. So that's been shared. Oops. Great. Wonderful. So please do take a look at that. The deadline is the end of this month, and I would love to have any submissions of any policy ideas that you have through this crowdsourcing challenge. There is a blog which David has very kindly posted up. It's called Meeting the Needs of Tomorrow's World. It's on the Fellows Forum. So do take a look at that for a bit of additional information and context for what drove the challenge. But beyond that, nothing else really. Thank you so much for being great participants.